After the fall of the Aztecs, Spain didn't just claim land, it claimed a new world. In the ashes of Tenochtitlan, a brutal empire rose. But building New Spain wasn't triumph, it was transformation, forged in blood, belief, and betrayal. This is how Spain built its American crown. The city, once called the Venice of the Americas, lay in ruins. In August of 1521, Tenochtitlan, the heart of the mighty Aztec Empire, collapsed under the weight of siege, starvation, and steel. After months of brutal warfare, Hernán Cortés and his indigenous allies entered the shattered capital, not in triumph, but in desolation. Corpses floated in the canals. Temples were scorched. The once glittering city was reduced to a ghost of stone and ash. But for Spain, this was not the end. It was the beginning. Almost immediately, Cortés declared the lands conquered in the name of Charles V, King of Spain and Holy Roman Emperor. What had once been the Aztec Empire would now be called something new, New Spain. The name alone was imperial ambition made real, a signal that Spain wasn't just conquering a people, it was remaking a continent. Yet Cortés was not acting alone. News of his stunning victory had already reached Europe. Spain's monarchy, sensing the birth of an empire, began formalizing structures of governance, taxation, and control. What started as a military conquest now shifted into something far more enduring: colonization. In the weeks that followed the fall of Tenochtitlan, Spanish soldiers and indigenous allies looted what remained. Gold and precious artifacts were seized, temples torn down, and idols burned. But even as they destroyed the old, the Spanish began planning something new. Cortés had a vision: to build a city, not just for military rule, but for Christian civilization, for commerce, and for the eternal glory of Spain. By royal decree, the Cabildo of Mexico, the first colonial governing council, was established in 1522. Land was redistributed among the Spanish victors through a system of encomiendas, granting them authority over indigenous labor in exchange for promises of religious instruction. Indigenous nobles were coerced into cooperation, some hoping to preserve status, others simply to survive. But the Spanish presence remained fragile. Disease had swept through the native population with terrifying speed. Smallpox, typhus, and measles killed hundreds of thousands in a matter of months. Entire communities disappeared. The very fabric of the social world Cortés had conquered was disintegrating before his eyes. Still, construction began. Stones from razed temples were repurposed to build cathedrals. A cross was raised above the rubble of the Templo Mayor. The city would no longer be a symbol of Huitzilopochtli or Quetzalcoatl, but of Christ and Castile. From these ashes, New Spain emerged, part battlefield, part bureaucracy, and entirely transformed. Victory in war is never the same as control in peace. After the fall of Tenochtitlan, Hernán Cortés faced a new challenge: how to govern a world Spain barely understood. The swords had silenced the Aztec priests, but governing millions across jungles, mountains, and distant valleys would take more than brute force. Cortés had declared himself captain general and de facto ruler of the new lands, but his authority was fragile. While the crown in Spain celebrated its conquest, it also feared its growing independence. After all, this wasn't just a soldier anymore. This was a man now holding an empire. To stabilize New Spain, Cortés began issuing land grants and encomiendas. These were not just rewards to his fellow conquistadors, they were tools of control. In exchange for loyalty, Spanish captains received rights to indigenous labor, creating a system where survival for the native population often meant submission. It was exploitation wrapped in royal sanction. Yet even Cortés's allies grumbled. Many had expected vast wealth. Instead, they inherited broken cities, scattered resistance, and responsibility. The transition from plunder to governance proved painful. Soldiers became mayors, tax collectors, and landlords, roles they were never trained for. Meanwhile, the Spanish crown sent its own agents. In 1524, the Council of the Indies was established to administer all of Spain's American territories. That same year, Charles V dispatched officials from the royal treasury to audit Cortés's administration. A message was sent. New Spain would belong to the crown, not to a single conquistador. Then came the first audiencia, a high court imposed by Spain to govern the colony and curb Cortés's power. The audiencia was meant to bring order, but it was plagued by corruption and violence. The indigenous population, already devastated, now found itself trapped between local warlords and imperial judges. Still, colonization advanced. Spanish-style towns were built across central Mexico, complete with plazas, cathedrals, and cabildos. Roads followed ancient indigenous paths, repurposed for tribute, not trade. Spanish law replaced native codes. Trial by fire became trial by cross. Indigenous rulers were sometimes allowed to keep local authority, but only if they submitted fully to Spanish rule and the Catholic Church. Cortés, meanwhile, was fading from power. By the late 1520s, he had been stripped of most political authority and retreated to a sprawling estate in Cuernavaca. Though he remained rich and infamous, his vision of ruling New Spain as a personal kingdom had failed. Spain had taken the empire, but it would be governed by the monarchy, not its conqueror. The transition from conquest to colonization was neither clean nor kind. It was slow, violent, and built on the backs of survivors. Spain now sought not just gold, it sought order, taxation, and eternal Catholic dominion. What rose from the ruins was not peace, but bureaucracy, the slow machinery of empire grinding forward. If Spanish swords brought conquest, it was the cross that promised salvation or subjugation. No empire was complete without its soul. For Spain, that soul was Catholicism. And in New Spain, it would be planted deep and wide, even if it meant burying centuries of indigenous belief. From the earliest days after the fall of Tenochtitlan, missionaries walked behind the conquistadors, carrying crucifixes instead of weapons. But their mission was no less transformative. They came not to trade, but to convert, not to understand, but to replace. Among the first were the Franciscans, who arrived in 1524, just 3 years after the city's fall. Known as the 12 Apostles of Mexico, these friars saw themselves as spiritual conquerors. They wore rough robes, spoke of humility, and marched into indigenous towns preaching the gospel, determined to wash away the old gods with holy water. Soon came the Dominicans, Augustinians, and later the Jesuits, each bringing a different style of evangelization, but all united under the banner of one goal: to Christianize the native population. Baptisms happened in the thousands. Idols were smashed, temples destroyed, native languages translated, then filtered through Christian doctrine. Churches were built atop pyramid foundations. The stones of Templo Mayor became the stones of Mexico City Cathedral. Indigenous spiritual centers became parishes, monasteries, and convents. The transformation was both symbolic and literal, a world inverted, reordered under God and the crown. To the Spaniards, this was progress. To many indigenous people, it was an apocalypse. But not all missionaries were cruel. Some became fierce defenders of indigenous rights. Bartolomé de las Casas, a Dominican friar, emerged as a powerful voice against the abuse of native peoples. He described the horrors of conquest, the enslavement, the burning of villages, and called it a sin against God. His writings would reach the Spanish court, igniting debates that echoed through Europe. Still, the church was not just a voice of conscience, it was an engine of power. It controlled education, marriages, landholdings, and identity. To be baptized was to be counted. To take confession was to be recorded. The church was the heart of Spain's social order, and every indigenous person was expected to find their place within it, or risk exclusion, or worse. By the mid-16th century, the Catholic Church had become the most dominant institution in New Spain after the Crown. Mission schools trained indigenous elites in Latin, Spanish, and theology. Religious festivals replaced seasonal ceremonies. Saints took the place of ancient gods, and colonial cities pulsed with the rhythm of bells, processions, and liturgical time. And yet, beneath the surface, echoes of indigenous belief survived. Some blended the old with the new, creating syncretic faiths. A masked Christianity that looked Spanish but remembered Nahua, Maya, or Mixtec gods. Others resisted quietly, preserving oral histories, hiding idols, or practicing ceremonies in secret. In the Church's triumph was also a contradiction. It had come to save souls, but often erased identities. In trying to build heaven on earth, it had helped construct one of the most enduring instruments of empire. The sword conquered, the cross converted, but it was silver that made the empire run. While gold had lured Spain across oceans, it was silver, deep in the veins of New Spain's mountains, that would sustain the Spanish Empire for centuries. This new colony wasn't just a trophy. It was now a machine of extraction. In the 1540s, silver was discovered in Zacatecas, a barren, windswept region north of Mexico City. It was a find so rich that the Spanish crown quickly realized the Americas weren't just a colonial outpost. They were an economic engine. Other strikes followed: Guanajuato, San Luis Potosí, and Taxco. Each discovery fueled a silver fever that echoed through Europe and Asia. But silver doesn't mine itself. To work these treacherous shafts and smelting furnaces, Spain turned to indigenous labor through a system called the repartimiento. Technically, it was rotational labor, meant to be temporary and humane. In reality, it was forced labor with devastating consequences. Men were pulled from their communities, marched hundreds of miles, and compelled to work in toxic conditions. They hauled ore. They carried mercury. They breathed poison in dark, airless tunnels. Many never returned home. Those who stayed in their villages weren't spared. Spain imposed a tribute system, demanding goods, crops, or currency from native communities. What had once been voluntary exchanges under Aztec rule now became fixed and taxed obligations. Entire villages were reorganized to fulfill quotas: corn, cloth, labor, feathers, cocoa, dyes, and above it all stood the Encomienda, a system where Spanish elites were granted the right to collect tribute and labor from native communities in exchange for protecting and Christianizing them. It was a medieval contract twisted into colonial profit. Abuse was rampant. Oversight was rare. For the elite Spaniards, life was luxurious. Haciendas, vast agricultural estates, spread across the countryside. Sugar mills, cattle ranches, wheat fields, and vineyards supplied both the local market and distant galleons headed for Europe. Land was consolidated into the hands of a few. The many worked it without end. But the wealth didn't stay in New Spain. Ships loaded with silver left Veracruz, crossed the Atlantic, and arrived in Seville. From there, the treasure fed European wars, built palaces, and paid debts. Some even flowed further east, traded for silk, spices, and porcelain in China and India. The global economy was being born, and New Spain was its beating heart. Yet at the core of this economy was suffering. By the end of the 16th century, millions of indigenous people had died, not just from disease, but from the relentless demands of an imperial economy. The empire grew, but its foundations were cracked with cruelty. Silver brought glory to Spain, but for those who mined it, the price was their lives. In the sprawling cities and dusty villages of New Spain, Spain did more than govern. It engineered society. After the conquest, The Spanish crown needed a system not only to rule, but to classify, control, and divide. And so, a complex social order emerged, one built on blood, birth, and color. It would come to be known as the casta system, and it would shape daily life in the colony for centuries. At the top stood the Peninsulares, Spaniards born in Europe. They held the highest offices, governed the viceroyalty, and controlled the wealthiest estates. Below them were the Criollos, Spaniards born in the Americas. Though ethnically Spanish, they were considered a step below their Iberian cousins. Their frustration would smolder for generations, eventually exploding in independence movements. Then came the mestizos, children of Spanish and indigenous unions. As their numbers grew, they became the face of colonial towns, merchants, artisans, soldiers, and middlemen. They were the bridge and the barrier between two worlds. Lower still were the indigenous peoples, who remained the majority. Though technically protected by Spanish law and the Catholic Church, they were taxed, forced to labor, and largely excluded from political power. Their languages were tolerated, but only until Spanish replaced them in schools and courts. And finally, at the bottom, were the enslaved Africans and their descendants. Imported through coastal ports like Veracruz, they worked in mines, sugar mills, and city homes. Though fewer in number than in Brazil or the Caribbean, their presence shaped the culture, cuisine, and music of the colony in profound ways. The caste system didn't stop at broad categories. Colonial society obsessed over detail. A dizzying array of racial combinations, castizos, mulattoes, zambos, moriscos, albinos, were recorded in birth registers and even painted in so-called casta paintings, which visually mapped out racial mixtures like a biological flowchart. These classifications weren't just labels. They determined legal rights, taxes, clothing, marriage options, even the ability to become a priest or a soldier. Culture in New Spain was just as stratified. European customs dominated public life, Spanish fashion, architecture, music, and language. The wealthy built elaborate Baroque cathedrals, wore silks from Manila, and held festivals for Catholic saints. But beneath the surface, a hybrid world flourished. Indigenous craftsmanship continued. Woven textiles, pottery, and featherwork. African rhythms mixed with Spanish guitars. Nahuatl words crept into everyday Spanish. Local saints took on the characteristics of ancient gods. Even food told the story. Tamales with lard, mole with chocolate, corn with cheese and cream. A plate of conquest, resistance, and fusion. Control was enforced not just by law, but by appearance. Clothing was regulated. Fine silks for the Spanish, humble cloth for the rest. Public behavior was watched. Order was everything. Surveillance came not only from soldiers and priests, but from neighbors, magistrates, and the church itself. This was not a melting pot. It was a hierarchical tapestry, carefully stitched, strictly maintained. But beneath the embroidery, unrest grew. Because for every classification imposed, 1,000 realities defied it. And eventually, the people of New Spain would question the very order that claimed to define them. New Spain glittered with the wealth of empire. Cathedrals gleaming with gold, plazas teeming with commerce, officials cloaked in authority. But under the surface of that opulence pulsed a quiet, persistent resistance. From the very beginning, indigenous peoples resisted. Some rebellions were immediate, violent, and desperate. Like the Mixtan War of the 1540s, when the Caxcan people of western Mexico rose against forced tribute and religious conversion. Spanish armies crushed the revolt, but it wasn't the last. Others fought back in less visible ways, by retreating into remote regions, preserving languages in secret, and practicing old rituals behind the facade of Catholicism. The Maya of Yucatan, the Tarahumara of the north, and many others kept their culture alive in defiance of colonial suppression. In some villages, Nahua deities hid behind the faces of Christian saints. The enslaved Africans brought to New Spain also resisted. Some fled into mountains and forests, forming maroon communities, free settlements far from colonial control. In Veracruz and the highlands of Guerrero, these groups, called chimarrones, became legends of freedom, raiding plantations, protecting their own, and vanishing into the wild. Even within the cities, resistance simmered. Women, indigenous and mixed race, often bore the burdens of both racial and gender oppression. Denied legal voice, they wielded resistance in domestic spaces through oral storytelling, clandestine healing practices, and unlicensed markets. In homes and alleyways, they passed on the survival strategies of their ancestors. Then there were the legal rebels, those who used the Spanish system to challenge it. Indigenous communities filed lawsuits in colonial courts to protect ancestral lands. Some won, others were stalled for decades. But each case revealed a truth. The people of New Spain were not passive subjects. They learned the tools of empire and used them to push back. Religious rebellion was its own battlefield. Catholicism, officially triumphant, often masked a deeper war of belief. Syncretism, the blending of Christian and indigenous faiths, became a subtle act of resistance. The Virgin of Guadalupe, for example, came to embody both Christian sanctity and indigenous symbolism. In her, many found both faith and freedom. At times, open revolt flared again. In 1624, Mexico City exploded in popular protest when the Spanish viceroy was accused of corruption and tyranny. Criollos, mestizos, and even indigenous workers joined the unrest, forcing his removal. Though brief, it showed that colonial unity was fragile, and resistance could cross caste lines. But most defiance was quiet. A refusal to forget, a whispered story, a hidden altar, a song sung in Nahuatl or Yoruba when no Spanish ear was near. These acts didn't make headlines or court records, but they endured. Resistance in New Spain was not always revolutionary. Often, it was resilience. The resilience of cultures that refused to vanish, of people who found freedom in small spaces, of a colony that looked peaceful from afar, while beneath, it rumbled. By the late 1500s, New Spain was no longer just a distant colony. It had become the beating economic heart of the Spanish Empire, and its pulse was silver. Deep beneath the rugged mountains of Zacatecas, Guanajuato, and San Luis Potosí, Spanish engineers and indigenous laborers carved tunnels into the earth. These silver mines weren't just profitable, they were world-changing. The discovery of silver in Zacatecas in 1546 marked a turning point. Within decades, Mexico became the world's largest supplier of silver. The mines of Potosí in Upper Peru, now Bolivia, and those in New Spain together produced nearly 80% of the global silver supply. This silver was more than wealth. It was power. Mined by indigenous workers and enslaved Africans under the brutal repartimiento and encomienda systems, silver fueled Spain's imperial ambitions. It paid for armies, funded monarchs, built cathedrals, and subsidized wars from the Netherlands to the Philippines. But extracting it came at immense human cost. Each mine required thousands of laborers. The work was exhausting, dangerous, and often deadly. Mercury, used to extract silver from ore, poisoned lungs and waterways. Collapsed shafts buried men alive. Entire generations of indigenous families were pulled into a cycle of labor that blurred the line between tax and slavery. As silver production surged, so did its reach. From the port of Veracruz, silver traveled across the Atlantic to Seville, where the Spanish crown taxed it heavily. But Spain didn't keep it for long. Much of that silver went to Italy, the Low Countries, and Germany, paying debts from endless wars. And from Acapulco, silver crossed the Pacific aboard the Manila galleons, traded for Chinese silk, porcelain, and spices, binding New Spain into a global economy centuries ahead of its time. In a strange twist of fate, silver from Mexico began to reshape economies far beyond the Americas. China's Ming dynasty began to accept Spanish silver as its primary currency. Markets in India and Japan responded to the influx. Entire systems of commerce adjusted to the silver that flowed from Latin American soil. Within New Spain, silver also transformed society. Boomtowns like Zacatecas and Guanajuato became bustling urban centers, complete with churches, theaters, and printing presses. Spanish merchants, miners, and clergy established a stronghold in the highlands, bringing with them bureaucracy, religion, and caste hierarchies. Wealth flooded into the hands of peninsulares and criollos, widening the gulf between colonial elites and the laboring masses. Yet the silver wealth rarely trickled down. Most indigenous communities saw little benefit. For them, silver meant broken families, polluted lands, and endless quotas. As mining intensified, indigenous displacement increased, and new slave routes expanded to meet the demand. Still, the engine roared on. Silver was the reason New Spain mattered. It gave the colony global significance and made the Spanish Empire rich beyond imagination, if only briefly. And while the coins bore the image of Spanish kings, the wealth they represented was extracted with blood and sweat from people who would never touch it. New Spain was the crown jewel. Silver was its heartbeat. But that heartbeat came with a heavy price. With the sword came the cross. As Spain tightened its grip on New Spain, it wasn't only kings and conquistadors shaping the land. It was also bishops, friars, and missionaries. The Catholic Church became one of the most powerful forces in colonial society, not only spreading faith, but redefining culture, education, law, and even architecture. Almost immediately after the conquest, Franciscans, Dominicans, and Augustinians flooded into the new colony. Their mission was clear: to convert the indigenous peoples of the Americas to Christianity. But conversion wasn't just about belief. It was about control. Dozens of mission churches were built over raised temples, physically replacing indigenous cosmology with Christian monuments. Crosses rose where idols had stood. Bells tolled over pyramids turned into rubble. The church framed the destruction as divine triumph. But for many indigenous peoples, it was a spiritual invasion. Massive conversion campaigns followed. Missionaries learned indigenous languages like Nahuatl, Mixtec, and Zapotec, crafting sermons and catechisms that could be understood by local populations. Thousands were baptized in sweeping ceremonies. New Christian names were given, replacing ancestral ones. But conversion was rarely simple and never one-sided. In countless communities, indigenous people blended Christian rituals with their own sacred traditions. This syncretism gave rise to unique forms of faith that defied simple labels. Spanish priests may have seen it as heresy, but for the indigenous faithful, it was survival. Saints were worshipped alongside ancient gods. Christian festivals took on a local flavor. Churches were adorned with indigenous carvings and patterns. One of the most striking examples came in 1531, when the indigenous convert Juan Diego reported a vision of the Virgin Mary on the hill of Tepeyac. The Virgin appeared not as a European figure, but as a mestiza, dark-skinned and familiar. She became known as the Virgin of Guadalupe, and her image spread like wildfire. For many indigenous people, she symbolized a bridge between two worlds. To the church, she became a powerful tool of unity and legitimacy. The church didn't stop at faith. It became a central pillar of colonial governance. Through missions, monasteries, and cathedral schools, the church introduced European-style education, Spanish literacy, and Catholic doctrine to generations of indigenous and mestizo children. Priests often acted as judges, record keepers, and administrators. Religious orders even managed massive tracts of land, becoming wealthier than many noble families. But this power also brought contradictions. While some friars genuinely fought to protect indigenous communities, figures like Bartolomé de las Casas, who denounced the abuses of colonization, others participated in the enslavement, punishment, and forced labor of the very people they preached to. The Church justified many horrors in the name of salvation. Its message of divine mercy was often delivered with violence. Yet the cultural fusion it catalyzed was undeniable. Over time, New Spain became neither fully Spanish nor purely indigenous. It was something new, a hybrid civilization where cathedrals echoed with indigenous prayers and saints were honored with flowers, feathers, and native songs. From architecture to language to belief, the Church's influence was everywhere, and so too was resistance, adaptation, and reinvention. In the heart of New Spain, the cross did not merely conquer, it collided, it transformed. And in that transformation, a new spiritual identity emerged, forever marked by both devotion and defiance. Beneath the gilded facade of New Spain's churches and palaces lay a rigid structure that governed every life, every interaction, and every opportunity. It was not just an empire of land, it was an empire of rank, meticulously engineered to maintain control. This was the colonial caste system, or Sistema de Castas, a social architecture as carefully layered as the pyramids it replaced. At the top of this pyramid stood the Peninsulares, Spaniards born in Europe, sent to New Spain as governors, bishops, judges, and military commanders. They held the highest offices, received the most significant grants of land, and controlled the crown's policies in the Americas. To be born in Spain was to be born above the law. Beneath them were the Criollos, Spaniards born in the New World. Though just as wealthy and often better educated, Criollos were excluded from key positions of power. Their ambitions simmered under the surface, fueling centuries of tension that would eventually explode into revolution. Below the Criollos came the mestizos, those of mixed indigenous and Spanish ancestry. Mestizos were the fastest-growing population in New Spain. They worked as artisans, merchants, soldiers, and clerks, but were rarely allowed to climb into elite society. Their status was ambiguous, Spanish enough to be functional, indigenous sufficient to be denied. Then came the indigenous peoples, forcibly folded into a society they did not build, and often did not want. Though legally considered subjects of the crown and granted certain protections, in practice they were oppressed, taxed, and exploited. Many worked under the Encomienda system, forced to labor for Spanish landlords in exchange for vague promises of protection and religious instruction. Their ancient titles and noble lineages held no significance for the colonial bureaucracy. Lower still were the Africans, brought through the transatlantic slave trade to toil in mines, plantations, and households. Unlike the indigenous peoples, Africans were considered property, not subjects. They were beaten, branded, sold, and silenced. Yet their music, food, language, and faith found ways to survive, leaving indelible marks on the culture of New Spain. As generations passed, the mixing of blood created new classifications: mulattoes, African and Spanish, zombos, African and indigenous, and dozens more, each with a specific label, legal status, and social expectation. Colonial officials kept painting caste charts, elaborate oil portraits that showed a man, a woman, their mixed-race child, and a caption naming the precise caste. These charts were not art. They were tools of control. It was a society obsessed with purity of blood, with birthright, with lineage. Social mobility was possible, but rare, and often required bribes, forged papers, or the erasure of one's ancestry. Identity became a mask, worn for survival. Yet, even within this oppressive system, resistance began to brew. mestizo intellectuals, indigenous scribes, African maroons, and Criollo writers began to challenge the hierarchy, whispering of equality and independence. The very system built to divide would, in time, create the seeds of rebellion. New Spain was not just a colony, it was a complex reality of privilege and pain, constructed like a staircase with many unable to climb it. Every birth certificate, every church record, every court ruling reinforced this architecture of inequality. And yet, like all empires built on division, its foundations were already beginning to crack. By the late 1700s, the Empire of New Spain had grown vast and profitable. But beneath the glittering surface, fault lines were spreading like cracks in ancient stone. The streets of Mexico City buzzed with merchants, soldiers, and friars, but also with discontent, rumors, and the first whispers of revolution. At the heart of the unrest was a deep resentment among the Criollos, Spaniards born in the Americas. Despite their wealth, education, and influence, they were barred from the highest offices, which remained the exclusive domain of Peninsulares. The message was clear: no matter how loyal or capable, you would never rule your own land if you weren't born in Spain. This frustration festered in salons and universities. Criollo priests and thinkers, inspired by the Enlightenment ideas of liberty, reason, and natural rights, began to question the legitimacy of colonial rule. Figures like Francisco Javier Clavijero and Carlos Maria de Bustamante began writing histories that celebrated indigenous civilizations and criticized Spanish tyranny. They saw themselves not as Spaniards, but as Mexicans. At the same time, the Bourbon Reforms, a series of economic and administrative changes launched by the Spanish crown, fueled unrest. Designed to squeeze more revenue from the colonies, these reforms raised taxes, centralized power, and cut into the privileges of local elites. The church lost land. Guilds lost autonomy. Indigenous communities faced even harsher tribute demands. Worse still, these reforms gave Peninsulares even more control, alienating the Criollos further. The colonial government, in trying to tighten its grip, was unknowingly loosening the glue that held New Spain together. Meanwhile, revolts and uprisings spread through the countryside. Indigenous communities resisted forced labor and tribute. African maroon settlements, runaway slave communities, flourished in remote jungles. In places like Yucatan and Michoacán, rebel leaders stirred old resentments, invoking local deities and ancestral rites. But the true accelerant came from across the sea. In 1789, the French Revolution toppled a monarchy. In 1791, Haitian slaves overthrew their colonial masters and declared independence. And in 1808, Napoleon invaded Spain, capturing King Ferdinand VII and placing his brother on the throne. For the colonies, this shattered the illusion of royal authority. Suddenly, questions that had simmered for decades boiled over. If there is no king in Spain, to whom do we owe allegiance? If liberty is a right in France, why is it a crime in Mexico? If slaves in Haiti can win their freedom, why can't we? The answers came in the form of conspiracies, secret meetings, and underground newspapers. The seeds were planted by students, priests, soldiers, merchants, men and women from all corners of the caste system who realized that the empire's chains were not divine, but man-made. One priest in particular, a Criollo named Miguel Hidalgo y Costilla, began to gather forces of disillusioned peasants, mestizos, and indigenous villagers. In 1810, he would ride into history under the banner of El Grito de Dolores, calling for the end of Spanish rule. But even before his cry, the air was heavy with inevitability. New Spain, once the shining jewel of the Spanish Empire, was now a powder keg. The layers of oppression, exploitation, and injustice that had built it were now the same forces tearing it apart from within. The age of conquest was ending. The age of independence was about to begin.